Wade Holloway slammed the ledger shut so hard the lamp on Cole Mercer's desk rattled in its base. You want to bring her in to check my books? His voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a threat. That woman's been here 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Cole, and you're going to let some fat widow from nowhere tell you how your ranch is being run? Cole said nothing. He just watched. Wade leaned across the desk, close enough that Cole could smell the whiskey on his breath. You fire me over some cook's gossip. You'll lose half your crew by morning, I promise you that. He straightened up, adjusted his hat, and walked out without being dismissed, like a man who'd already decided how the story ended. He hadn't looked at Eleanor once, not even when she was standing right there in the doorway. That was his first mistake. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city or country below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train pulled into Harlow Creek on a Tuesday, which Eleanor Voss had always considered an honest day of the week. Not the false promise of a Monday, not the relief of a Friday. Tuesday was just Tuesday, the day you showed up and got to work. She stepped off the platform carrying one suitcase, a canvas bag over her shoulder, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to them. The cold hit her immediately. Kansas in February was not a suggestion. It was an argument, and it wanted to win. She stood on the platform for a moment, not because she was lost, but because she was taking stock. Old habit. Before you walk into any room, you learn what you can from the outside. Harlow Creek was smaller than the letter had made it sound. 2 streets wide in either direction, a general store, a feed depot, a sheriff's office with a lantern burning in the window even at midday, and a saloon that looked like it hadn't been painted since the war. The people who passed her on the platform glanced at her the way people glance at something that doesn't quite fit, briefly, with mild confusion, then away. She was used to that. Eleanor Voss was 43 years old, heavy-set in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than idleness, with thick hands and a face that people often described as plain before they got to know her, and then struggled to describe at all. She wore a dark gray dress, practical boots, and a coat that had seen better decades. She did not look like a woman arriving to take up an important position, which was, in most situations, an advantage. The wagon that met her was driven by a young hand named Pete Dawson, barely 20, with red ears and a nervous habit of touching the brim of his hat every few sentences. He introduced himself, took her suitcase without being asked, which she noted favorably, and helped her up onto the bench seat. Blackthorn's about 8 miles east, he said, clicking his tongue at the horse. Mr. Mercer said to bring you straight in. Supper's at 6 sharp. The men get real particular about 6. Do they? Eleanor said. Yes, ma'am. He glanced at her sideways. You done much ranch cooking before? Some. It's a lot of men. 14 hands plus Mr. Mercer and Mr. Holloway. Mr. Holloway's the foreman. He runs the daily operations. And what does Mr. Mercer run? Pete thought about that longer than the question probably required. Everything else, I suppose. Eleanor watched the flat land move past them. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and close, and the wind came across the fields with nothing to slow it down. She pulled her coat tighter and kept watching. What happened to the last cook? She asked. Pete touched his hat brim. She left. Why? Another pause. She just left. Sudden. Mr. Holloway said it wasn't a good fit. Eleanor filed that away and asked nothing else for the rest of the ride. Cole Mercer was not what she expected, which was itself not surprising. Eleanor had learned years ago that the picture people painted of someone in a letter rarely matched the person who showed up to shake your hand. The letter she'd received had been brief, direct, and unsigned beyond the name at the bottom. C. Mercer, Blackthorn Ranch, Harlow Creek, Kansas. It had listed the wage, the duties, the expectations, and nothing else. No pleasantries, no promises. The man who met us in the yard was somewhere in his late 40s, lean through the shoulders and square through the jaw, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of squinting into wind and sun. He was not unkind looking, but he was closed, the way a good barn door is closed, latched from the inside, solid wood with no gaps. He shook her hand once, firm, and looked at her the way a man looks at livestock he's considering buying. Not cruel, just assessing. She held still for it. She'd been assessed before. You're Eleanor Voss. I am. You can cook for 14 men? I can cook for 20 if the pantry's stocked right. He nodded, though something in his expression suggested he'd believe that when he saw it. Kitchen's through there. Marta will show you the stores. Supper's at 6. Breakfast at 5:30. I don't want to hear about problems I can solve by paying you to not have them. Understood. He walked away. That was the whole of it. The kitchen was large, which was the first good thing she found. The second good thing was Marta Reyes, a compact Mexican woman of about 60, who had been working at Blackthorn for 11 years, and who greeted Eleanor not with warmth exactly, but with a frank, appraising look that Eleanor respected considerably more. He told me to show you where things are, Marta said. He didn't say I had to think it'll work. Fair enough, Eleanor said. Show me the stores. What Marta showed her was not encouraging. The pantry was disorganized in the specific way that happens when someone capable leaves suddenly and no one replaces the system, only the body. There were supplies stacked on top of other supplies, older stock buried behind newer deliveries, and a barrel of flour with a mouse hole in the bottom corner that no one had apparently thought to mention. Eleanor stood in the middle of it for a moment, not speaking. Bad? Marta asked from the doorway. Fixable, Eleanor said, but it's been like this a while. Marta shrugged. Wade orders the supplies. Always has. Mr. Mercer doesn't come in here much. Wade Holloway. Yes. Eleanor turned to look at her. You like him? Marta's face went carefully neutral. He runs the ranch. What I like doesn't come into it. That was an answer, just not a yes. She had 4 hours before supper. She spent them reorganizing the pantry, pulling the oldest stores forward, tying off the flour barrel with rope until she could replace it, and taking a full inventory of what was actually on hand versus what the supply list on the wall claimed should be there. The numbers didn't match. Not wildly, not in a way that screamed at you, but consistently, in the way that a leak doesn't announce itself. It just quietly drains until one day you reach for something and it's gone. She noted it, said nothing. Yet. The men came in for supper at 6 o'clock in the way that hungry men always come in. Too many at once, too loud, filling up the space with boots and cold air and the smell of animals and work. Eleanor had made a pot roast with the beef she'd found, roasted root vegetables, bread from a starter she'd mixed while the pantry was drying out, and a gravy that she knew, practically, would settle arguments. They were not ready to be impressed. She heard them before she saw them. A low murmur moving through the group, a few barely covered laughs. She'd walked through enough rooms to know what that sound meant. Lord, one of them said, it's somewhere near the back. She ain't exactly what I pictured. Cole losing his mind, bringing in somebody like that? Be quiet, said a third voice, lower and harder than the others. That one she didn't recognize. Eleanor ladled the first plate and set it at the end of the table without comment. Then the second. Then the third. She moved with economy. No wasted motion, no fuss. The way she'd learned to do everything when she understood that the fewer reasons you gave people to watch you, the more they focused on the food. They ate. The room got quieter than rooms full of hungry men usually got. Not polite quiet. The other kind. The kind where people are concentrating. A man named Hector, who she'd learned later was the oldest of the ranch hands, set down his fork and looked at her across the table with an expression that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite a compliment. That's the best thing I've eaten since my mother died, he said. I'm sorry about your mother, Eleanor said. She was 78 and mean as a rattler, Hector said. Don't be sorry. A few of the men laughed, real laughs, the short kind that happen before people decide if they're allowed to like you. She was clearing the last plates when Wade Holloway came in. She recognized him before anyone told her who he was, the way you sometimes recognize a type of weather without looking at the sky. He was tall, broad through the chest, with a thick mustache, and the particular confidence of a man who had never, in his adult life, walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there. He wore his authority the way some men wore good boots, broken in, comfortable, not thinking about it anymore. He looked at her the way the others had, except without the quick glance away. He held it. You're the new cook, he said. Eleanor Voss, she said because she preferred being called by her name. Holloway, he said, not offering a first name. How was supper? I'd say it went fine. He looked at the table where the men were still sitting, a few of them scraping plates. Something crossed his face, not anger exactly, but the closest cousin to it. The look of a man who notices his audience is paying attention to something other than him. "Good," he said, in a tone that meant he hadn't decided that yet. He sat at the head of the table without being invited, picked up a plate that Marta had kept warm, and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who treats meals as fuel. No one spoke much while he ate. The easy mood from a moment before had shifted, the way a room shifts when a different kind of person walks into it. Eleanor washed the pots and said nothing, but she watched. The first week was about learning the rhythms. She woke at 4:30, started the fire, had coffee ready before the hands came in at 5:15 looking for something hot. She varied the breakfast, not because anyone asked her to, but because men who eat the same thing every morning start to feel, somewhere under the surface, like nothing changes, and men who feel like nothing changes get careless. Small variations signaled that someone was paying attention, and people work differently when they feel attended to. This was not a theory she had read. It was something she had learned from 20 years of keeping a household, managing a sick husband, and watching people carefully enough to understand what they needed before they knew to ask for it. Cole Mercer noticed. He didn't say so directly. She was coming to understand that direct appreciation wasn't in his vocabulary the way it was in some people's. But he started appearing in the kitchen doorway around 5 o'clock, not quite early enough for food, getting his coffee with a quiet word and leaning against the frame for a moment longer than necessary. On Thursday of the first week, he said, "The men are steadier." Eleanor looked up from the pan she was tending. "Pardon?" "The hands. They're calmer, less friction in the mornings." He said it like he was reporting weather, not giving her credit for anything. "They're eating better," she said simply. He nodded. "What did you do with the stores? Marta said you reorganized." "They were disorganized." "Anything missing?" She paused. Half a second, no more. "Nothing that would be obvious if you weren't looking." He held her gaze for a moment. He was sharper than he appeared, she decided. Not the kind of sharp that showed off, but the kind that waits. "I'm looking," he said. "Then I'll let you know if I find anything else." He finished his coffee and left. She turned back to the pan and allowed herself for just a moment to exhale. Wade Holloway came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning when Marta was in the yard and Eleanor was alone. He didn't knock. The kitchen wasn't a room people knocked for. He stood in the doorway with his thumbs in his belt and watched her move around the room with the particular attention of someone who wants you to know he's watching. "You've been poking around the supply lists," he said. Eleanor didn't stop working. She was rolling dough on the table, something that required attention and gave her a reason not to look up. "I manage the kitchen," she said. "The supply lists are part of the kitchen." "They're part of what I manage," he said. "The ordering's always been mine." "I know that. I'm not trying to change your system. I just need to understand what we have and what we need. And you couldn't ask me that directly?" She looked up then, steady, no apology in it. "I'm asking you now, Mr. Holloway. If there are records you'd rather I work from, I'm happy to use them. Which ones do you prefer?" It was a nothing question, an absolutely reasonable question, and it put him in the position of either producing the records or explaining why he didn't want her to have them. He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I'll have Pete pull them for you." "Thank you," she said, and went back to the dough. Pete brought the records that afternoon, a stack of ledger pages, supply orders going back 18 months. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table after supper, when the men were in the bunkhouse and the fire was burning low, and she read through every line. The discrepancies were small. That was the clever part. Not the kind of thing you'd catch with a single look or even a season of looks. But taken over 18 months, pattern by pattern, the numbers told a story that the individual pages didn't. Flour ordered, 40 pounds. Flour received, by her own count of what was in stores and what had been used, 31. Bacon, ordered in quantities that didn't match the portions served. Salt pork, same. And the prices? Some suppliers appeared twice, with slightly different names and slightly different rates, both signed off by the same hand. She didn't touch the pages. She made her own notes on a separate sheet, folded them twice, and tucked them into the lining of her coat. She was not ready to move. Not yet. She needed more time, more pattern, and she needed to understand one more thing, how long this had been happening, and whether Cole Mercer could possibly not know. Because there were two possibilities. Either Cole was blind to what was happening under his roof, or he wasn't, and she couldn't afford to be wrong about which one. The answer came to her not from the ledgers, but from watching his face. She brought Cole a discrepancy she had framed as an accident, a simple ordering mistake, easily corrected, nothing that pointed to anyone. She showed it to him over coffee one morning, laid the numbers out plainly, and watched his eyes move across the page. He frowned. "This isn't right." "No," she said. "But it's a common enough error when orders go through multiple hands. Easy to fix if we put a check in the system." He looked up at her. "Wade sees all the orders." "I know," she said carefully. "I just wanted to flag it." She watched him. He was troubled. Genuinely, not performatively. There was no recognition in his face when she named Wade, no slight tightening of the eye that would have told her he already knew. What she saw instead was the particular discomfort of a man who's been handed a problem he wasn't prepared for and isn't sure what to do with it yet. He didn't know. Which meant she could tell him, but she had to do it right, and she had to do it with everything she had. Because if she moved too early or with incomplete evidence, Wade would dismiss her, and Cole, she suspected, was exactly loyal enough to let it happen. She gave herself 3 more weeks. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, through its details. She walked the grounds in the early mornings, before the hands were fully up, not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to understand the scope of what she was seeing in those ledgers. There was a lot of land here. Good land, productive land, the kind of land that had taken years of hard work and risk to build into something. And someone was quietly eating at it, month by month, like rot in a foundation. She talked to the men, not directly about the money, she was too careful for that, but in the way that cooking gives you, the natural conversation that happens while you're ladling soup and a man is hungry and his guard is down. She heard things, small things, a delivery that had come in short, a side of beef that never made it to the smokehouse, a supplier who'd come twice in 1 month, which was unusual. Hector was the most useful. He'd been on the ranch 11 years and had the kind of memory that old cowboys develop when they've worked the same land long enough that change becomes visible to them the way it isn't to anyone else. "That flour," he said one afternoon, when she mentioned offhandedly that she'd had to stretch the batch. "Happened before. 6 months ago, maybe. And before that? Same time every year?" He squinted at the middle distance. "Close enough." She filed it away. What she wasn't prepared for was the moment Wade found her notes. She had been careful. She thought she'd been careful. But the kitchen was not a private space, and Wade moved through the ranch with the easy familiarity of a man who considered all of it his territory. On a Thursday afternoon, when she had stepped out to the yard to speak to Pete about the next supply order, she came back to find the kitchen exactly as she'd left it. Except for one thing. The folded sheet of paper that had been tucked behind the flour canister was gone. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went about the rest of her afternoon as though nothing had happened. But her heart was moving faster than usual, and she was thinking hard. That evening, Wade found her alone in the kitchen again. This time, he didn't pretend it was casual. "You've been writing things down," he said. "I write down everything," she said. "Inventory, schedules, orders. It's how I keep the kitchen running." "That's not what I mean." She turned to face him. "Then what do you mean, Mr. Holloway?" He stepped forward. He was a big man, and he knew how to use that. Not with his hands, not yet, but with proximity, with the kind of space that makes smaller people remember. They're smaller. Eleanor did not step back. She had lived with a man who used his size to fill a room, who let his body do the threatening while his voice stayed reasonable. She knew the geometry of it. She knew that the moment you moved away from it, you confirmed what they wanted you to believe about yourself. She held her ground and met his eyes. "I know what you're doing," he said quietly, "and I want you to understand something. I've been running this ranch for 7 years. I know every man on it. I know Cole Mercer better than he knows himself. Whatever you think you found in those papers, it's nothing. And if you try to make it into something, you won't be the first woman to find out that her word doesn't carry much weight in this county." Silence. Eleanor let it sit for a moment. Then she said, "Supper will be ready at 6, Mr. Holloway." He stared at her. Then he walked out. She stood at the stove, her back straight, her hands steadier than she felt. And she thought, all right, now I know where we are. She also knew she was out of time. The next morning, she asked Marta to watch the stove and walked to Cole Mercer's office before he'd finished his second cup of coffee. She knocked once and went in without waiting to be told. Cole looked up from his desk. He started to say something about the hour, then stopped. Something in her face told him this was not a conversation about kitchen logistics. "Sit down," he said instead. "I'd rather stand." She put the papers on his desk. 3 weeks of notes, organized by date and by type of discrepancy, cross-referenced against the supply log she'd been given. Every number accounted for, every shortfall documented. 18 months of quiet, patient theft, laid out in plain handwriting on a kitchen table. "This is Wade Holloway," she said. "And I believe it's been going on longer than the records I've seen." Cole Mercer didn't move for a long moment. He looked at the papers the way a man looks at something that is going to cost him, and he already knows it, and he's still hoping he's wrong. Then he looked up at her. "How long have you known?" "I had a suspicion in the first week," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." "And now you're certain?" "Yes." He looked back at the papers. His jaw was tight. She watched him go through the numbers. He was faster than she expected, which told her he understood the ranch's finances better than he let on. And she watched the moment the full picture landed on him. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted, the way light shifts when a cloud moves. "He told me you'd be trouble," Cole said quietly, not accusing her, just saying it. "I expect he did," Eleanor said. Cole sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear the yard coming to life. Horses, voices, the particular sounds of early morning work. "I need to verify this," he said finally. "I know. I'm not doubting you. I need to see it myself." "Understood. There's a secondary account on the 4th page. I'd start there. It's the most recent and the most clearly documented." He nodded. He was still looking at the papers. She had the sense that he was not entirely sure what to do with her right now. With this woman standing in his office at 7 in the morning who had just handed him a catastrophe wrapped in careful handwriting. "You could have left," he said. "It wasn't your problem." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She turned and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Cole Mercer pick up the papers and begin to read. She had started something that wasn't going to stop now. And somewhere on the ranch, Wade Holloway was already feeling it. The particular animal instinct that tells you when the ground has shifted beneath your feet, even before you can name what changed. Cole Mercer did not sleep that night. Eleanor knew this not because she saw him, but because the lamp in his office window burned until past 2 in the morning, and she was awake to see it go out. She had not slept well either. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that served as her quarters, staring at the ceiling boards and listening to the wind come off the plain, and she thought about what she had set in motion. There was no taking it back. She had known that when she walked through his office door. You don't put something like that in front of a man and then ask him to forget it. The papers were in Cole's hands now, and whatever he did with them was going to determine everything, not just about Wade Holloway, but about her own place on this ranch, her own position in a town that didn't know her yet, and her own ability to keep the one stable thing she'd found in the last 2 years of her life. She had not come to Blackthorn Ranch looking for trouble. She had come looking for work and a wage and enough quiet to rebuild something after the years that had dismantled her. But trouble had already been here before she arrived, growing in the dark the way things grow when no one's watching them. She got up at 4:15, earlier than usual. She needed the extra time and she needed the movement. The kitchen fire was her first act of every morning, and she performed it now with the focused attention she gave to everything: paper, kindling, the particular angle of the draft that moved through this room. The fire caught on the second try. She put the coffee on and stood over it, watching the first thin curl of steam rise from the pot, and she thought, whatever happens today, the men still need breakfast at 5:30. That was the thing about work. It kept going regardless. Cole came in at 5 o'clock. Not for his usual coffee in the doorway routine. He came all the way in, pulled out the chair at the small work table she used for prep, and sat down in it like a man who'd been carrying something heavy all night and was finally willing to put it on the floor. He looked tired. Not just sleep tired, the other kind. The kind that comes from having your understanding of something change against your will. Eleanor poured him coffee without being asked and set it in front of him. She went back to the stove. "It goes back further than 18 months, he said. She didn't turn around. "I thought it might." I pulled records going back 3 years last night. The pattern's the same. He paused. She heard him wrap his hands around the mug. I built this ranch on trust. I'm not a man who watches over people's shoulders. I always thought, if you hire someone right, you don't have to. That's not a flaw, she said. That's a reasonable way to run an operation. It's how you get robbed for 3 years. She turned then, because the flatness in his voice told her that what he needed right now was not agreement, but a face to talk to. She leaned against the counter and looked at him steadily. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to confront him. When? Today, this morning, before the men are out. She nodded slowly. He'll deny it. I know. He'll say I fabricated it, or that I misunderstood the bookkeeping. He'll have an explanation for every individual line that sounds just plausible enough to create doubt. Cole looked at her. Will that explanation hold? Not against everything I documented, but he'll try. She picked up her coffee. He already warned me off, Mr. Mercer, 2 nights ago, in this kitchen. He told me my word doesn't carry weight in this county. Something moved through Cole's expression. Not quite anger, but the precursor to it. The moment before anger, when a man realizes he's been misjudged by someone he trusted. He said that to you directly. He did. What did you say back? I told him supper would be ready at 6. Cole stared at her for a moment, and then something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Almost not at all. It wasn't quite a smile. Cole Mercer didn't seem like a man who smiled easily, but it was the closest thing to one she'd seen from him. All right, he said. He stood up, finished the coffee in 2 long swallows, and set the mug down. I'll handle it. He left. She heard his boots on the wooden floor heading toward the front of the house, and then toward the yard. She turned back to the stove. She had never, in her life, been good at waiting. She heard the confrontation before she saw it. She was carrying a bucket of slops to the yard when the voices reached her from the direction of the barn. Cole's voice, flat and controlled, and Wade's, which started low and reasonable, and then climbed in a way that had nothing reasonable left in it. She set the bucket down and stayed where she was. She couldn't make out all the words. She caught pieces. Records, 3 years, explain this, and then from Wade, louder. That woman, set you up? You're going to believe some cook over me? And then Cole's voice again, quieter, which told her more than the words did, because quiet from Cole Mercer was not retreat. It was the opposite. 2 of the younger hands, Clem and a boy named Doyle, had stopped near the fence and were watching the barn with the carefully casual air of men who are absolutely eavesdropping. When they noticed Eleanor standing there, Clem looked at her with a question in his face that he was too uncomfortable to ask out loud. She picked up the bucket and walked back inside. Wade came into the kitchen 20 minutes later. She had expected him, and she was ready, standing at the stove, fully occupied, nothing in her posture that gave him a target. But this was not the Wade Holloway who had stood in her kitchen 2 nights ago and made quiet threats. That man had been confident, controlled. This one had something harder and hotter moving under the surface, and it made him more dangerous, not less, because men who are losing their grip are not careful about what they reach for. You went to him last night, he said. I went to him this morning, she said. With documentation, that's all. Documentation. He said the word like it tasted bad. 3 weeks on this ranch, and you're handing Cole Mercer documents about how his operation runs. Someone had to. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped on the other side of the work table. She noted that he stopped, that he didn't come around it. And he put both hands flat on the surface and leaned forward. You have no idea what you've done, he said. You don't know this ranch. You don't know this territory. You don't know what it takes to run an operation like this, the deals you have to make, the way things actually work when you're managing men and land and cattle and suppliers who all want more than you've got. I know what I found in those records. You found what you decided to find. You came here looking for something wrong, and so that's what you saw. She turned to face him fully. Did I write those supplier accounts, Mr. Holloway? Did I create the secondary billing entries? Because they're in your handwriting. I checked. His eyes went cold. It was a fast shift, from heated to cold. And that was the most dangerous moment, she thought, when a man stops trying to talk his way out and starts calculating. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. I promise you that. You made that promise the other night, she said. You'll have to do better than repeating it. He straightened up, adjusted his hat, and walked out. It was the second time he'd walked out of her kitchen after losing an exchange with her. She was aware that there would not be a third time. Men like Wade Holloway did not keep fighting battles the same way after they'd lost them twice. They changed tactics. She needed to be ready for that. Cole dismissed Wade from Blackthorn Ranch that afternoon. She heard about it from Marta, who had heard it from Hector, who had been close enough to the office to know. Cole had given him a week's pay and told him to be off the property by nightfall. Wade had taken it with a stillness that Hector described as worse than yelling. He didn't argue? Eleanor asked. Not after the second time Cole showed him the supplier accounts, Marta said. She was shelling beans at the table, her hands moving in their practiced rhythm. But he didn't look like a man who was finished. He looked like a man who was thinking. Did he say anything? Marta's hand slowed for just a moment. He said he'd make sure the county knew what kind of woman Cole had brought onto his ranch. Eleanor was quiet. Outside, she could hear the particular sounds of a crew that knows something has shifted. The too careful conversations, the gaps where certain voices used to be. Does that worry you? Marta asked. Not unkindly. Direct, the way Marta did everything. Some, Eleanor admitted. This isn't my county. I don't have history here. What history do you have? Eleanor picked up a handful of beans and started shelling alongside her. It was a long moment before she answered. I married a man who got sick 2 years after the wedding and spent the next 12 years getting sicker. I ran the household. I kept things together. And when he died, the household turned out to be mostly debt and a brother-in-law who thought widowhood was an opportunity. She set the shelled beans in the bowl. So I left. Marta didn't say she was sorry. Eleanor appreciated that. The brother-in-law, Marta said. He's still around? As far as I know. He the kind to make trouble from a distance? Eleanor looked at her. I don't know yet, she said honestly. It was an answer she was going to think about for a long time. The days that followed Wade's departure had a tentative quality, like the first warm week after a hard winter, when everyone wants to believe it'll hold, but no one quite believes it yet. The men were different without him. Not immediately better, but looser. Conversations at the supper table ran longer. Hector told a story about a horse he'd broken in Texas that turned into 3 stories, and no one told him to stop. Cole moved differently too. Or maybe Eleanor was just watching him more carefully now that she understood what kind of man he was. He walked the ranch with the same purposefulness he always had, but something had shifted in the set of his shoulders. A tightness that had been there before, that she'd taken for his natural manner, was gone. He looked like a man who had put down a weight he'd been carrying long enough to forget he was carrying it. He came by the kitchen every morning, always for coffee, officially. But the conversations had gotten longer. On the 4th morning after Wade's dismissal, he sat at the work table again and watched her work for a while before he spoke. The supply orders need restructuring, he said. The whole system. The way Wade had it set up. I want it rebuilt from scratch. I know, she said. I've been thinking about it. I figured you had. He turned his mug in his hands. I'd like you to handle it. Not just the kitchen orders. The full supply system for the ranch. She stopped what she was doing. She turned to look at him. That's foreman work, she said. I know what it is. The men might not take it well. A woman managing the accounts. The men are eating the best food of their lives, and they know who made that happen. He said it plainly, without flattery. Just an assessment. They'll adjust. She studied him for a moment. Cole Mercer had the quality, rare in her experience, of meaning exactly what he said and nothing more. There was no hidden angle in the offer. He had a problem. She had demonstrated the capacity to handle it, and he was extending the logical consequence of that. All right, she said, I'll need access to the full account records, not just the supply logs. You'll have them. And I'll need to sit in on the supplier meetings, at least until I understand who we're dealing with. He nodded. Done. She turned back to the stove. Then yes, I'll handle it. She heard him stand up. He was almost to the door when she said, without turning around, Mr. Mercer. Yeah. Wade Holloway is going to do something with what he knows. He's not a man who accepts losing quietly. A silence. No, Cole said. He's not. I want you to know that when he does, and whatever he says, the records will speak for themselves. I know that. I just wanted to say it plainly, so there's no confusion later about where I stand. Another pause, longer this time. Eleanor, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name. I believed those records before I finished the second page, and I had the whole night to second guess it. He paused. I didn't. He left. She stood at the stove and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. The first supply meeting was on a Thursday, 10 days after Wade's departure. 3 suppliers came in: a flour merchant from Wichita named Garvey, a cattle feed dealer named Briggs, and a man named Phelps who handled the salt and preserved goods. Eleanor sat at the table across from Cole and said almost nothing for the first half hour. She listened. She was good at listening. People underestimated how much you could learn from the first few minutes of a conversation if you were paying attention to the right things. Not just the words, but the rhythm, the pauses, the glances, the small adjustments men made when they were slightly uncomfortable. Garvey was straightforward. His prices were fair, his delivery record was solid, and he talked about his product with the simple confidence of someone who doesn't need to oversell it because it sells itself. Briggs was another matter. I was smooth in the way that always made Eleanor want to count her silverware afterward. Not dishonest exactly, but oriented toward whatever he needed to be in the moment. He'd been one of the secondary suppliers on Wade's lists. Not the fraudulent account, but adjacent to it. When they reached the pricing discussion, Eleanor set her notepad on the table and asked one question. Just one. Mr. Briggs, your rate for mixed feed went up 11% between March and August of last year. What drove that increase? Briggs looked at her, then at Cole, then back at her. Market pricing, he said. Grain costs. Grain costs in the regional index went up 3% in that period, she said. I checked this morning. Silence. Cole said nothing. He just watched Briggs with the particular patience of a man who has all day. Briggs recalculated his pricing by the end of the meeting. The new rate was 9% below what he'd been charging Wade. When the suppliers had gone, Cole sat at the table for a moment and then said, You looked up grain index prices this morning. Before breakfast, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't amusement exactly. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something in between, or maybe something else entirely. The look of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already understood. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. She started gathering her notes. I kept the books for my husband's business for 12 years. He was ill, but the business still ran. It had to. What kind of business? Hardware. Small operation. Nothing like this. She folded her papers. But numbers are numbers, Mr. Mercer. The scale changes, the principles don't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole. She looked up. You've been calling me Mr. Mercer for 3 weeks. At this point, he stopped, seemed to consider whether he was going to finish the sentence. Cole is fine. It was, she recognized, an awkward thing for him to say. He'd said it anyway, which told her something about him that she filed away alongside everything else she was learning about this man. All right, she said. Cole. He nodded once and picked up his hat from the chair beside him. The Briggs account goes through you from now on. All of them do. He was gone before she could respond, which was perhaps the point. The weeks that followed were the most demanding of her time on the ranch, and also, quietly, the most satisfying. She restructured the supply system from the foundation up, building in checks that prevented any single person from controlling both the ordering and the receiving. She hired a young woman from town named Agnes Pratt to help in the kitchen 3 days a week, which freed Eleanor to spend more time on the accounts without the meals suffering. The men grumbled about Agnes at first, the way men grumble about anything new, until they realized the food hadn't gotten worse, and Eleanor was still in the kitchen every morning. After that, they left it alone. Cole reviewed everything she produced and rarely changed anything. He asked questions sometimes, good ones, the kind that told her he was actually reading what she gave him and not just signing off on it. She started expecting those questions and preparing answers in advance, which led to conversations that ran longer than they probably needed to, and that she found herself looking forward to in a way she didn't examine too closely. It was Marta who said something first. They were cleaning up after supper on a Wednesday when Marta, without any preamble, said, "He trusts you." Eleanor was scrubbing a pot. She didn't look up. "He trusts the work." "It's the same thing with him," Marta said. "You understand that, yes? For Cole Mercer, the work is the person. He doesn't separate them. Eleanor considered this. What are you saying, Marta? I'm saying I've been here 11 years. Marta dried her hands on her apron. I've never seen him give anyone what he's given you. Not this fast. He gave Wade authority over the whole financial operation for 7 years. That's different. Wade pushed for it, took it piece by piece until it was natural that he had it. She folded the apron over the rail. What Cole's given you, he offered. There's a difference. Eleanor set the pot down and thought about that. I'm not looking for anything beyond what I'm doing, she said. Marta looked at her with the tolerant patience of a woman who has watched people misunderstand themselves for 6 decades. I didn't say you were, she said, and went to bed. It was 2 days later that the first rumor reached Harlow Creek. Eleanor heard it from Pete, who heard it from the feed store owner, who'd heard it from 3 separate people on the same afternoon. The story was that Eleanor Voss had come to Blackthorn Ranch not as a cook, but as a schemer, that she had fabricated evidence against Wade Holloway to position herself to take control of the ranch's finances, that she had manipulated Cole Mercer, who was a widower and therefore susceptible, and that the woman's history before Harlow Creek was best left unexamined. Pete told her with the awkward discomfort of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to deliver. He stood in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hands, and said, I don't believe it. I just thought you ought to know. Thank you, Pete, she said. I appreciate you telling me. He lingered. What are you going to do? Finish the supply reconciliation for April, she said. Then start on May. He blinked. Yeah. Okay. He put his hat back on. For what it's worth, Hector told the man at the feed store he was full of, well, that Hector didn't believe a word of it. Tell Hector I said thank you. She did finish the April reconciliation. She sat at the kitchen table after supper and worked through it line by line, her pen moving in its steady rhythm, and she did not let herself think about what was being said in town or who was saying it or whether it was going to matter. She thought about the numbers, she thought about the patterns, she thought about what was in front of her and what she could actually do about it. It was, she had found, the only reliable response to things she could not control. Control what you can. Document what you can't. Keep moving. But that night, alone in her small room, she lay awake longer than usual. She had been here before, not this specific situation, but this territory. The moment when something she'd built began to feel real, and that feeling made her aware of how much she had to lose. Her first years in this part of the country had taught her that the world was quick to dismiss women who didn't fit its expectations, and quicker still to punish them for exceeding those expectations. She had been too quiet, then too capable, then too visible. Every version of herself had found a new reason to be used against her. She was tired of it, not defeated tired, the other kind, the tiredness that sharpens into something harder if you let it. She thought about Wade Holloway with his careful smile and his promise that she'd regret it. She thought about the supplier accounts and the secondary billing entries and the name she'd recognized at the edge of one of the older records. A name she hadn't mentioned to Cole yet because she wasn't sure she'd seen it right, and she needed to see it twice before she was sure of anything. Daniel Graves. She had seen that name in the oldest supply logs attached to a cattle shipment that predated Wade's systematic theft. A side account, barely visible if you weren't looking for it, connected to a supplier who no longer existed and an address that corresponded to no business she could locate. Daniel Graves had been her husband's brother. She lay in the dark and thought about what that meant, and what it would mean for everything she was trying to build here, and how much longer she had before the ground she was standing on became the battlefield she could already feel forming beneath her feet. Sleep came eventually. It was not restful, but in the morning, the fire needed starting, and the coffee needed starting, and 14 men needed feeding, and Eleanor Voss got up and did all of those things with the same steady hands she did everything with, because that was the only way she knew how to live. One task at a time, one day at a time, never letting the weight of what was coming stop her from doing what was needed right now. And what was needed right now was breakfast. She cracked the first egg into the cast iron and listened to it sizzle and watched the white set around the edges, and she thought, all right, let's see what the next thing is. She didn't have to wait long. Cole found her at the end of that day, not in the kitchen, but in the small office off the main room where she'd been working on the account ledgers. He came in and closed the door behind him, which he hadn't done before, and she knew before he spoke that something had shifted again. He set a piece of paper on the desk in front of her. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to the county land office. "This arrived today," he said, "forwarded from the county recorder's office." She looked at it. The letter claimed that Eleanor Voss had been involved in fraudulent land claims in 2 counties prior to her arrival in Harlow Creek. It was signed by a notary. It had the formal weight of something official that had been carefully constructed to look more official than it was. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "This is Daniel Graves," she said quietly. Cole frowned. "Who is Daniel Graves?" She took a slow breath, and then she told him the part of her story she hadn't told him yet, the part she'd been hoping she wouldn't need to. Cole listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she was coming to understand about him. He could be still in a way that few people were, genuinely still, not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually absorbing what he was hearing. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "He followed you here," Cole said, "or found me here. I'm not sure which is worse. Why would he? What does he gain from destroying your reputation in a county you just arrived in?" She looked at the letter on the desk. "Because I left with documentation of what he did, and he knows it. And if my credibility is gone before I can use it, whatever I have doesn't matter." Cole was quiet again. "Then, what did he do?" "He emptied the estate after my husband died. Accounts, property, everything that should have come to me. He had a lawyer draw papers I didn't fully understand, and I signed them because I was exhausted and grieving, and I trusted that a family member wouldn't—" She stopped, set her hands flat on the desk. "I trusted the wrong person. And then I figured out what had happened, and I gathered what documentation I could, and I left before he could do anything about it." She met Cole's eyes. "He's been looking for me," she said, "and now he's found me somewhere I finally have standing, somewhere people might actually listen to me if I file a complaint." She looked at the letter again. "He has to destroy that before it can happen." Cole reached across and picked up the letter. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it down and said, "What documentation do you have?" She looked at him. "What?" "On Graves. On what he did to the estate. You said you gathered what you could before you left. What do you have?" She hadn't expected the question, or rather, she hadn't expected it to be the first question. She'd expected doubt or caution, or the particular retreat of a man who has decided that the woman he trusted has brought more complication to his door than she's worth. She hadn't expected him to immediately ask about her evidence. "Copies of the original estate documents," she said slowly. "Bank correspondence. 2 witness statements from people in my husband's town who saw the transfers happen. Not complete. He had better lawyers than I had time to fight." She paused. "But enough." Cole nodded. "Then we'll need a lawyer." He said it the way he'd said the supply accounts go through you, as though it were simply the next logical step, a problem with a solution, resources to be applied. "Cole." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "This is my problem. It's not yours." He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, because he was a man who kept most of his face reserved, and the part he was showing her now was not something she'd seen before. "3 weeks ago," he said, "you walked into my office at 7 in the morning with 3 weeks' worth of careful work and put it on my desk. You didn't have to do that. You could have kept your head down, done your kitchen work, and kept the comfortable position you'd earned." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't." She said nothing. "So don't tell me what is and isn't my problem," he said. "We'll get you a lawyer." He picked up the letter and walked out of the office. Eleanor sat at the desk for a long moment after he left, her hands still flat on the surface, the lamp burning low, the sound of the ranch settling into evening coming through the walls around her. She had arrived at Blackthorn with 1 suitcase and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying everything alone for too long. She had not expected this. She was not sure yet what to do with it. But outside, she could hear Cole Mercer's voice in the yard, giving orders, making decisions, moving forward with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided what needed to be done. She folded her notes, tucked them into the ledger, and stood up. There was still supper to finish. The lawyer Cole found was named Harmon Tuttle, and he was not what Eleanor had pictured. She had pictured someone polished, the kind of man who kept his boots clean and his opinions expensive. What she got was a compact, gray-haired figure in a rumpled brown coat who arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on a Friday morning in a wagon that looked older than he did, and who shook her hand with the directness of someone who had long ago stopped performing competence and simply had it. He sat at the kitchen table with her documents spread in front of him and read for 20 minutes without saying anything. Cole stood near the window with his arms crossed, which was how Eleanor had come to recognize that he was thinking hard about something. Marta was pointedly busy near the stove, which was how Eleanor had come to recognize that Marta was listening to everything. Tuttle turned the last page over and looked up. These witness statements, he said. Are these people still in the county where they were signed? As far as I know, Eleanor said. The woman, Mrs. Eldecroft, was a neighbor. She saw my husband sign the original bequest documents. She was in the room. She'll testify? She told me she would. When I left, she pressed my hands and told me to find somewhere safe and fight from there. Eleanor paused. I wrote to her last week. I haven't had a reply yet. Tuttle looked at the letter from the county land office, the one Daniel Graves had sent, with its official-looking seal and its carefully constructed lies. He held it up by the corner, the way you hold something you don't want to touch more of than necessary. This is well done, he said. Whoever helped him write this understood how to use official language to imply things it doesn't directly claim. It doesn't say you committed fraud. It says you were involved in situations that warranted examination. That's a harder thing to disprove than a direct accusation because there's nothing specific to deny. I know, Eleanor said, but it's also a softer weapon than he might want. Tuttle set it down. If he had real evidence, he'd have filed a complaint, not a letter. A letter like this is a warning shot. He's trying to damage your standing before you can use what you have against him. Then he knows I'm going to use it, Cole said from the window. He knows she has it, Tuttle said. He looked at Eleanor. The question is whether we move first or wait for him to move again. If we wait, he'll file something more formal. If we move first, we file on the estate fraud, Eleanor said. Yes. In the county where it happened, which is not this county, which means I'd need to coordinate with an attorney there. I know a man in Caldwell who handles estate matters. Honest, careful. But it takes time. He folded his hands on the table. In the meantime, you're here, and the talk in town is already doing damage. The room was quiet for a moment. Eleanor looked at the documents in front of her, the copies she'd carried wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her suitcase, the things she'd grabbed in the last hours before she left, the evidence of a theft she hadn't understood fully until it was already over. What do I do about the talk? She asked. Tuttle leaned back. You live correctly. You keep your work good and your behavior beyond question. You don't go into town looking defensive, and you don't stay away from town looking guilty. You go in, you do your business, you let people see who you actually are. He said it plainly, without softening it. It's unfair. It takes longer than it should. But a reputation built on observation is harder to tear down than one built on introduction, Cole said from across the room. She's been doing that since she got here. Tuttle looked at him, then back at Eleanor with a slight recalibration in his expression. Good. Keep doing it. He gathered the documents and promised to write to his colleague in Caldwell by the end of the week. He refused coffee because he had 2 other clients to see before dark, shook Eleanor's hand again, and climbed back into his ancient wagon with the deliberate care of a man who has learned not to hurry the things that matter. Eleanor watched him go and then stood in the yard for a long moment, her arms at her sides, the cold working its way through her coat. Cole came to stand beside her, not close, just present. He's good, he said. Old school. Doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win. He didn't say he could win this one. He didn't say he couldn't, Cole paused. He took the documents. That's the tell with Tuttle. She looked at him. You know him well? I've used him twice. Once over a water rights dispute. Once when a supplier tried to claim ownership of cattle I'd purchased fair. He won both. He was quiet for a moment. He's slow, but he's thorough. Slow might be a problem, she said. Graves won't wait. No, Cole agreed. He won't. She went back inside. She had bread to start and accounts to finish, and a list of supply corrections to draft, and the work would keep her anchored in a way that nothing else could. She had learned that about herself a long time ago, that the best thing for a mind that was running ahead of itself was to put your hands on something concrete and make it right. She started the bread. The first time Eleanor went into Harlow Creek alone was on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Tuttle's visit. She needed to pick up a supply order that had come in by rail and to speak to the dry goods merchant about a discrepancy in the invoice he'd sent out to the ranch. Simple business. The kind of thing she'd done a dozen times in her previous life without a second thought. She drove the wagon herself, which Pete had offered to do for her and which she had politely declined. Not because she didn't appreciate the offer, but because arriving in town behind a young ranch hand would have looked like she needed an escort, and she was not going to start down that road. The town watched her. She had expected that, and she was prepared for it. The way heads turned in the general store, the particular quality of silence that follows someone whose story has arrived before they have. She had dressed carefully without dressing formally, and she walked into the merchant's office with her invoice in hand and her posture straight and her face arranged in the neutral expression she'd practiced since she was 17 years old. Not cold, not eager, not asking for anything. The merchant's name was Calloway. He was a thin man with quick eyes and the faint air of someone who was always calculating what something was worth. He looked at her invoice and then at her, and Eleanor could see him deciding in real time how to play the situation. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I heard you were handling things at the Mercer place." "I'm managing the supply accounts," she said. "This invoice is off by $14. The third line, the salt pork. The rate you charge doesn't match the rate you agreed to in the last contract." He looked at the invoice. A small pause. "Clerical error. I'll issue a corrected one." "Thank you." She folded her copy and put it in her bag. "I'll also need the corrected rate applied retroactively to the last 2 orders." The quick eyes stopped being quick for a moment. "That's... The contracted rate was agreed in writing," she said. "I have the contract. The rate applies to all orders under it." Silence. Calloway looked at her with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic and not getting the answer he wanted. "I'll speak to my accountant," he said. "I'll need the corrected invoices by end of next week," she said, "or I'll need to look at other suppliers for the salt pork going forward." She said it pleasantly. She meant every word of it. She was at the door when he said, "You know, there are people in this town who have questions about how you came to be managing Cole Mercer's accounts. After being here, 2 months? She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She took one breath, quiet, through her nose, the way she did when she needed a moment to choose the right next thing. Then she turned around. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I came to Blackthorn Ranch as a cook. I found problems that were costing the ranch money, and I documented them and brought them to the owner, and he chose to give me more responsibility based on the quality of that work." She held his gaze. "If someone in this town has specific questions about that, I'm happy to answer them directly. I'm in town every Thursday. But I don't discuss the ranch's business through the general drift of conversation." She paused. "The corrected invoices by next week. Thank you for your time." She walked out. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heartbeat was not. But no one could see that part, and that was the part that mattered. She loaded the supply order into the wagon, checked the manifest against the delivery, found 2 items short, and went back to correct it. The young man at the freight desk was apologetic and quick about it. She thanked him, climbed back up onto the wagon bench, and drove out of Harlow Creek at a pace that was not hurried. 2 miles out, on the flat road back to the ranch with the prairie on both sides and no one to see, she exhaled. Then she straightened her back and kept driving. The reply from Mrs. Eldecroft arrived on a Saturday, in an envelope that had been handled enough times during transit to look like it had survived a minor disaster. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table after supper, with Marta across from her pretending to mend a dish towel. The letter was short. Mrs. Croft wrote in a cramped, slanted hand that suggested age and urgency in equal measure. "Dear Eleanor, I will testify. I have been waiting for someone to ask me. I saw what Daniel did, and I have not slept well in 2 years knowing I said nothing. Tell me where to come and when. I am not a young woman, but I am not a tired one. God keep you. Eldecroft." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and pressed it flat with her palm and sat with it under her hand for a moment. "Good news?" Marta asked, not looking up from the dish towel. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The kind that helps, or the kind that just makes things more complicated?" Eleanor thought about it. "Both," she said. She wrote to Tuttle the same night. What happened next came from a direction she hadn't fully accounted for, which was the thing about troubles. They rarely arrived from where you were watching. She was in the barn on a Monday morning, doing something she did once a week without telling anyone. walking the livestock areas and comparing what she found there against the livestock records she'd been steadily rebuilding. It was not kitchen work, strictly speaking, and she had not been asked to do it, but the supply discrepancies she'd found in the first weeks had all touched the livestock accounts in some way, and she had not been comfortable until she'd walked the whole line herself. She was counting the second pen when she heard voices outside the barn wall. Two men, keeping their voices low but not low enough, the way people always overestimate how thick a wooden wall is. One voice she didn't recognize. The other was Wade Holloway. She went completely still. Needs to be something that puts her in the wrong on the ranch itself, Wade was saying. Not just the county land stuff. Something Cole can see with his own eyes. Like what? The other voice was younger, nervous. Like missing inventory. Something that came in, got logged, and then turned up gone. If it's in her handwriting in the records, you want me to change the records. I want you to add a line. That's all. One line in the receiving ledger. Something that shows she signed for goods that never made it to stores. A silence. Wade, if Cole finds out, Cole's not going to find out because Cole's going to be looking at what I show him, not going back through everything with a magnifying glass. He trusts her, yeah, but trust breaks when the numbers are wrong. That's the thing about someone who built her reputation on being good with numbers. Find one number she can't explain, and the whole picture changes. Eleanor did not move. She was aware of her own breathing, the need to keep it controlled, and she focused on that. Slow in, slow out. And she thought very clearly and very fast. The younger voice said, "When? Soon, this week. I need it done before her lawyer starts making noise." A pause. "How much?" $50. The sounds of two men moving, boots on hard ground, moving away from the barn wall. Eleanor waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she waited another full minute, which took considerable effort. Then she walked out of the barn and across the yard and into Cole's office without stopping. He looked up from his desk. He registered her face and put down his pen. "What happened?" She told him. Every word she'd heard, as exactly as she could reconstruct it. She was a precise person, and she knew the value of precision in moments like this, so she didn't interpret or editorialize. She just reported what she'd heard, in sequence, and let Cole draw his own conclusions. When she finished, he was very still. "Wade's still in the county," he said. It was not quite a question. "Apparently. And he's found someone on my crew who he thinks he can pay." His voice had gone flat in the way that, she was learning, was more alarming than anger. "Who was the second voice? Did you recognize it?" "No, younger, nervous, that's all I can say." Cole stood up. "I need to know which of my men." "Cole." She said it firmly, because he was already moving toward the door, and she needed him thinking before he acted. "If you go into the yard right now and start questioning people, you'll tip Wade that I heard him. He'll move faster, or differently, and we won't know what he's doing." He stopped. She said, "Let me check the receiving ledger. Today, before supper. If they're going to add a line, they haven't done it yet, or we'd already know. If we document the ledger as it stands right now, complete, accurate, witnessed, then anything that appears in it later will be provably added after." He turned to look at her. "You want to set a trap," he said. "I want to close a door," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right, do it. What do you need?" "Marta, as a witness, and you. I want 3 sets of eyes on the current ledger before end of day, and I want it signed and dated. Done." He moved to the door, then stopped. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "You were in the barn counting livestock inventory," he said. "Yes." "On your own time. Nobody asked you to." She held his gaze. "I don't wait to be asked when I see something that needs doing." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely name. Respect? Yes, but there was something alongside it that was warmer than respect and more careful, like a man holding something he's not sure how to carry. "I know," he said, and went to find Marta. They documented the receiving ledger that afternoon. Every page, every line, signed by Cole and Eleanor and Marta, with the date written 3 times in 3 different hands. It was not legal documentation in any formal sense, but it was a clear record of what existed before anything was changed, and that was the thing that mattered. The forged line appeared 4 days later. Eleanor found it on a Thursday morning near the bottom of a page she had personally signed 4 days prior. It was good work. The handwriting was close to hers. Not perfect, but close. The kind of close that would look right to someone who wasn't looking carefully. It claimed she had received a delivery of 40 pounds of salt pork on a date when she had, in fact, been in Harlow Creek on ranch business, with a receipt that proved it. She stared at it for a long moment, then she went to get Cole. He looked at the line. He looked at the signed and dated copy they had made 4 days ago, which showed the page before the addition. He looked at the receipt from Harlow Creek. He set everything down on the desk and pressed the heels of his hands against the surface and was silent for a long time. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question. "I don't know the name, but I'd look at whoever was on receiving duty the last 3 days. "Doyle," Cole said immediately. "Doyle's been on receiving." Doyle. The name caught on something in Eleanor's memory. The young hand who'd stood near the fence with Clem the morning Cole confronted Wade. Young, nervous. She had not heard the voice clearly enough to be certain, but "He's the one Wade paid," she said. "I think." Cole's jaw worked. "I'll deal with Doyle." "Carefully," Eleanor said. "If Doyle understands what's coming, he might be willing to tell us how much contact he's had with Wade, how long they've been talking. That's worth more than firing him." Cole looked at her with the expression she recognized now. The recalibration, the slight adjustment of his understanding to accommodate something she'd said that he hadn't expected. "You want to turn him?" "I want him to understand that cooperating is better than protecting a man who paid him $50 and will absolutely let him take the fall alone." It was a longer silence this time. "You heard the $50, he said. "I heard it." Cole exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll talk to him tonight." The conversation with Doyle, from what Cole told her afterward, was not long. The young hand was 22 years old and had been sending money home to his mother in Missouri. And when Cole laid out exactly what had been done and exactly what the legal consequences of forging documents on a ranch were, Doyle had gone pale enough that Cole had worried briefly for his health. He confirmed everything. Wade had approached him 3 days after his own dismissal. The $50 was real. There had been 2 conversations, both at the western fence line at dusk. And there was one other thing, something Doyle had been sitting on, clearly, because he delivered it with the manner of a man clearing a debt. "He talked about a man coming to town," Doyle said. "Didn't say who. But he said once this man arrived, things were going to move faster than Miss Voss expected." When Cole told Eleanor this, they were sitting in the office, late, the lamp burning between them. She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel Graves," she said. "You think he's coming here?" "I think he's been planning this longer than I have." She looked at her hands on the desk. "He would have hired someone to find where I went after I left. That takes time. And then he'd have had to make contact with Wade, which means they knew each other before I arrived, or they found each other quickly, which suggests—" She stopped. Something was assembling itself in her thinking, pieces clicking into place that she hadn't had the context for before. The supply account, the secondary billing. There was a name in the oldest records, Graves. I saw it and assumed it was coincidence, but she looked up at Cole. "Wade knew Daniel before either of us arrived here," she said. "This isn't 2 separate problems that happened to collide. This is one thing. It was always one thing." The silence in the room was different from previous silences. Heavier. The kind that carries weight. Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "So Graves helped set up Wade's scheme, or knew about it, and when you came here and started pulling on the thread, I was always going to lead back to him," Eleanor finished. "He couldn't let that happen." Cole lowered his gaze to her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since I saw the name in the old records." She met his eyes. "I wasn't certain. I'm not completely certain now. But it fits." "It fits too well to be wrong," he said. She nodded. "We need to get everything to Tuttle, not just the estate fraud, the supply account connections, the name in the old records, all of it. I'll ride to Tuttle in the morning." "Cole." She said it with enough weight that he stopped. "If Graves is coming here, if he's already in communication with people in this county, Tuttle needs to move on the filing before he arrives. Once Graves is here in person, it becomes a different kind of fight." "I'll leave at first light," Cole said. She stood up to go, gathering her papers. She was almost to the door when he said, "Eleanor." She stopped. When all of this is done, he said, and then he paused, as if he'd started a sentence without knowing how it ended. She turned to look at him. He was sitting at his desk with the lamp throwing orange light across his face, and he looked, for just that moment, like a man who was less guarded than he usually allowed himself to be. Tired, maybe. Or just present in a way that he usually wasn't. I was going to say something sensible, he said, about the legal strategy. Was it sensible? She asked. A pause. No, he admitted. Not particularly. She studied him for a moment. Outside, she could hear the ranch and its nighttime sounds, the distant low of cattle, the wind, the boards settling in the cold. Get some sleep, she said. You've got a long ride in the morning. Behind her, she heard him blow out the lamp. She did not sleep particularly well that night either, but for reasons that were harder to categorize than the legal situation, and that she was not ready to examine too carefully. Tuttle sent word back by Wednesday. He had filed a preliminary injunction in the county where the estate fraud occurred, and his colleague in Caldwell had begun the process of formal complaint. Mrs. Elda Croft was traveling, had already departed, in fact, by the time the letter reached Tuttle and would arrive within the week. Eleanor read the letter standing in the kitchen. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and went back to the stove because supper was in 2 hours and the men needed feeding. But her hands moved differently for the rest of that afternoon. Lighter, somehow. Like a woman who has been walking into a wind for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like when it finally stopped pushing back. It did not last. Because 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Pete came into the kitchen with the look he got when news arrived that he didn't want to be the one to deliver, and he said, "There's a man at the gate, Miss Voss. Says his name is Daniel Graves. Says he's your family and he's come to speak with you." Eleanor stood at the stove. She set down the spoon she was holding. She untied her apron and laid it over the chair. She smoothed her dress once, a single, deliberate motion, and then she turned around and looked at Pete with an expression that was entirely calm. "Tell him I'll be out directly," she said. Pete nodded and went. Marta looked at Eleanor from across the room with the particular silence of a woman who understands that what is about to happen matters enormously and that there is nothing useful to add to it. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for 15 seconds, maybe 20. She breathed slowly and she thought about what she had. She thought about the ledgers and the witness statements and Elda Croft in a wagon somewhere on a Kansas road, and Tuttle in Caldwell with documents that had his signature on them now, his credibility attached. Then she walked outside to meet the man who had spent 2 years trying to make sure this moment never came. Daniel Graves was standing near the fence by the gate. He was a tall man, soft in the way that men go soft when they have money and don't do physical work. He had the same coloring as her late husband, the dark hair, the pale eyes, which made looking at him complicated in ways she refused to let show on her face. He smiled when he saw her. It was the smile she remembered, warm, practiced, the kind that had fooled her once because she had wanted to be fooled. She stopped 10 feet from him and did not close the distance. "Eleanor," he said, "you're looking well." "Daniel," she said, "why are you here?" The smile held. "I heard you'd had some trouble up here, business with the foreman and some legal matters. I thought family ought to—" "We're not family," she said. "Not anymore. You made sure of that." His expression didn't change, which was itself a tell. A man with a clear conscience would have reacted. "I know you were upset when you left. I understand. You understand that I have documentation of everything you did," she said, "and that a lawyer in Caldwell filed papers this week, and that Elda Croft is currently on her way here to give testimony." She watched his face. "You didn't know about Elda." Something moved under the practiced surface of his expression, quick and controlled, but real. "I thought you should hear from me directly before this goes further," he said, and the warmth was gone now from his voice, replaced by something more careful and less pleasant. "Whatever you think you have, it's incomplete. It won't hold up." Maybe, she said. "Or maybe it will. That's what courts are for." "Eleanor." He stepped forward. She did not step back. He stopped. "You have a good thing here. A position, stability. I'm told Cole Mercer is a reasonable man. Why put all of that at risk for a legal fight you might not win, over money that's long since—" "It was my home," she said. Her voice came out very quiet and very clear. "Not the money. My home. Everything my husband built. Everything I helped him build for 12 years while he was sick, and I was the one keeping it standing. You took my home, Daniel, and then you let me leave thinking I had nothing. The quiet between them was full and cold. You came here to see how far along I was, she said, and now you know. So you can go back to wherever you've been staying and decide what your next move is. But I want you to understand something first. He waited. I have been underestimated my whole life, she said. By my husband's doctors who talked over my head. By the lawyers you hired who assumed I didn't read the papers they put in front of me. By the foreman on this ranch who thought a woman in a kitchen wouldn't understand what she was seeing in a supply ledger. She held his gaze. I am done being the thing people don't notice until it's too late. You should have thought about that before you found me. He stared at her. The practiced warmth was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was harder and colder and more honest. You'll regret this, he said. You and Wade Holloway have the same threat, she said. It wasn't convincing the first time. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides. She did not hurry. Behind her, she heard him stand at the fence for a long moment, and then the sound of a horse being turned and ridden away. Cole was standing on the porch. He had come out sometime during the conversation, she realized. She didn't know how much he'd heard. She looked at him as she climbed the steps, and he looked at her. And the silence between them was a different kind from all the other silences they'd accumulated. That was him, Cole said. Yes. You all right? She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything. Ask me again in an hour, she said. She went inside. She put her apron back on and went back to the stove and picked up the spoon she'd set down, and she started stirring. Her hands were steady. She had made them steady through force of will and the accumulated practice of 20 years of not letting anyone see her shake, and right now that was enough. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence line, Daniel Graves was riding toward town, and whatever he was planning next was already in motion. But so was everything she had put in motion. And she had started earlier than him, and she had better evidence, and she had people in her corner who had chosen to be there rather than being bought. That had to count for something. It had to be enough. Daniel Graves checked into the Harlow Creek Hotel that same Friday evening, and by Saturday morning, half the town knew he was there. Eleanor heard it from Agnes, who heard it from the woman who did the hotel laundry, who had heard Graves in the dining room the previous night telling anyone who would listen that he had come to Harlow Creek out of concern for his late brother's widow, that Eleanor was a troubled woman, that the family had worried about her for years, that her sudden departure from her home county had left unresolved questions that he felt, as her only remaining family, a responsibility to address. Agnes reported this at the kitchen table with the careful precision of someone who understood that the information mattered and who wanted to get it right. She was 24, Agnes Pratt, with a straightforward face and the kind of loyalty that comes not from affection exactly, but from having watched someone work honestly and deciding that counted for something. He was talking to the county recorder, Agnes added. Yesterday afternoon, before he checked in, Millie at the dry goods saw him go in. Eleanor was cutting potatoes. She kept cutting. The county recorder, she said. Yes, ma'am. She thought about that. The county recorder was not a judge and not a lawyer, but he controlled the official filing system for the county. What got entered, what got prioritized, what got quietly delayed. It was not the worst move Graves could have made, but it was a smart one. He was building relationships before the fight started, establishing himself as a reasonable, concerned family member rather than a man with legal exposure. She finished the potatoes and sent Agnes to the yard with a message for Pete. Cole came in from the north pasture at midday, and she told him over coffee what Agnes had reported. He listened with his elbows on the table and his jaw set in the way she'd come to associate with him, thinking hard about something that genuinely troubled him. The county recorder is Aldous Webb, he said. I know him. He's not corrupt, but he's a man who cares about his standing and doesn't like complications. Which means Graves will frame this as the complication, Eleanor said, and himself as the solution. He's had one day. He's been preparing for longer than one day. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Cole, I need to go see Tuttle. Today, not by letter. I need to understand exactly what's been filed and in what order, and whether there's anything Graves can do to slow it down on this end. I'll drive you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He stood up. I'll get the wagon. He said it with a finality that ended the conversation, and she let it end because she was tired this morning in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the sustained effort of staying ahead of people who were trying to outmaneuver her, and having someone else decide the simple logistics of the next 2 hours was, quietly, a relief she didn't want to examine. Tuttle's office was in a narrow building on the far end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, sandwiched between a surveyor's office and a building that appeared to have no clear purpose. The old lawyer was at his desk when they arrived, surrounded by papers and the organized chaos of a man who knows exactly where everything is and understands why the arrangement looks alarming to other people. He looked up when Cole and Eleanor came through the door, took in their expressions, and said, "Graves is in town." "Since yesterday," Eleanor said. Tuttle set down his pen. "Sit." They sat. Tuttle folded his hands and looked at his desk for a moment in the way of a man arranging his thoughts, rather than stalling. "All right, here's where we are. The filing in Caldwell is entered and dated. That's the most important thing. It exists in the official record before Graves arrived here, which means he cannot claim it was manufactured in response to his presence." He looked at Eleanor. "Your documentation, Mrs. Croft's coming testimony, and the bank correspondence are all attached to the filing. My colleague there is thorough." "What can Graves do to slow it down?" Eleanor asked. "He can file a countercomplaint questioning the validity of your documentation. He can argue the witness is unreliable. He can request delays on procedural grounds." Tuttle paused. "He can also make noise in this county that creates a hostile atmosphere for you personally, which won't affect the legal case in Caldwell, but will make your daily life considerably more difficult." "He's already doing that," Cole said. "I assumed he would." Tuttle opened a folder on his desk. "There's something else. My colleague in Caldwell found something when he was pulling the property records connected to the estate. There was a lien filed against the property 18 months ago. A lien that should have required your signature as the surviving spouse, Eleanor, but doesn't appear to have gotten it." Eleanor went still. "What kind of lien?" "Debt instrument. Against the value of the property, filed by a business associate of Graves." Tuttle looked at her over his glasses. "The signature on the lien document that's supposed to be yours. My colleague believes it's forged." The room was quiet for a moment. "He forged my signature," Eleanor said. Not a question. "The comparison to your actual signature on other documents suggests strongly that, yes, someone did." Tuttle's voice was careful but not gentle. He was giving her facts the way she gave Cole facts, plainly because the person receiving them was capable of handling them. "This is significant. Document forgery is a criminal matter, not just a civil one. It changes the shape of the case considerably." Eleanor absorbed this. She had known Daniel Graves was capable of a great deal, but she had constructed that knowledge over time, piece by piece, and each new piece still carried a particular kind of weight. The forgery of her signature was not surprising. It was just clarifying. It removed whatever remained of ambiguity about what kind of man she was dealing with. "How long have you known this?" she asked. "My colleague sent word 3 days ago. I was going to write to you today." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry you had to come in for it rather than receive it properly. But given that Graves is here, you needed to know quickly." She nodded once. "What's the next step?" "We request a formal examination of the forged document by the court. That requires a judge's order, which my colleague has already petitioned for. We also need—" He stopped. He looked at Cole. "This is delicate, Mr. Mercer." Cole looked back at him. "Say it." "We need a character affidavit from someone in this county, someone with standing, attesting to Eleanor's conduct and reliability since her arrival here." Tuttle set both palms flat on the desk. "Graves is going to argue to anyone who will listen that she is a manipulative, unscrupulous woman who latched onto a widower rancher and systematically positioned herself to benefit from his resources. He'll dress it in concern and family worry, but that's the argument." He paused. "A strong affidavit from Cole Mercer, who is known and respected in this county, is worth considerably more than anything I can file from outside it." The silence in the small office had a particular quality. Cole said without hesitation, "Write it. I'll sign it." Tuttle looked at him for a moment. "You understand this will put you directly in the middle of a legal dispute that isn't—" "Write it," Cole said again. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at Tuttle, his jaw still set in that way. And she thought about what it cost a man like Cole Mercer, private, careful, protective of his name and his ranch, and his standing in a community where he'd built everything from hard work to put himself into someone else's legal fight without a moment's visible hesitation. She thought about what Marta had said weeks ago. "What Cole's given you," he offered. "There's a difference." She said nothing. She was not sure she had words for it right now anyway. Tuttle began drafting immediately, asking Cole questions in his clipped, precise way and writing the answers in his careful hand. Eleanor sat beside Cole and answered the questions directed at her and tried to focus on the practical facts of the situation rather than the feeling that something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with legal documents. They were there for 2 hours. When they left, Tuttle had a draft to finalize and had promised to send a copy to his colleague in Caldwell by end of day. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride in. The afternoon light was long and flat across the prairie, the kind of light that makes everything look both very clear and very far away. Eleanor watched the land, thought about forged signatures and county recorders and an old woman named Elda Croft somewhere on a Kansas road. "Thank you," she said eventually. Cole kept his eyes on the road. "Don't. Cole, you documented 3 years of theft on my ranch and brought it to me when you didn't have to. You reorganized my supply system, renegotiated half my supplier contracts, and saved me more money in 2 months than I'd lost in the previous year." He paused. "Signing a piece of paper is not a large thing by comparison." She looked at him. "That's not why you did it." A silence. The horse's hooves on the packed dirt, the wind across the flat land. "No," he said. "It's not." He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. But the quiet between them was different from the careful professional quiet they'd maintained for most of the past months. It had something in it that she was going to have to think about when she had the space to do it honestly. That space was not tonight. Tonight there were other things. She was right about that because when they got back to the ranch, Hector was waiting at the yard gate with an expression that meant news had arrived during their absence. "Man came by," Hector said, "about an hour ago. Left a letter for you, Miss Voss. Said to make sure you got it personal." He held out a sealed envelope. No return address. Her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it standing in the yard. Cole waited. Hector waited at a respectful distance, in the way of a man who understands that some news is private and some isn't and isn't sure yet which this is. The letter was short. 3 sentences. "You should know that Wade Holloway and your brother-in-law met twice in this town before you arrived at Blackthorn Ranch. The second meeting was 6 weeks before you applied for the cook position. I thought you deserved to know this. A friend." Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she handed it to Cole. He read it once. His expression did not change outwardly, but something behind his eyes did. "6 weeks before you applied," he said. "Yes." "That means that the job was a setup," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "They found out where I was. Graves and Holloway. They found out I was looking for work. And they arranged, or at minimum they knew, that I would end up here, on a ranch where Holloway was already running his scheme." "Why?" Cole's voice had gone flat again, the flat that was worse than anger. "What does that get them?" "I don't know yet." She took the letter back from him and looked at it again. "But it gets them something, otherwise it's too much coincidence." She folded the letter. "Whoever sent this, they were watching, which means someone in this town has been watching all of it, and they chose just now to tell me." "That's not nothing," Hector said from his distance. They both looked at him. He shifted his hat brim. "Sorry, I heard." "It's not nothing," Cole agreed. He looked at Eleanor. "Can you think of anyone who might—" "No." She put the letter in her pocket. "But I'm going to." She thought about it through supper preparation, and through the meal itself, and through the cleanup after. And she was still thinking about it when she sat at the kitchen table in the late evening with the account ledgers open in front of her and the lamp burning and the house quiet around her. The letter was from someone who had access to information about Wade Holloway's movements before Eleanor's arrival. That meant either a ranch hand who'd been here during that period, or someone in town who'd witnessed the meetings directly. Someone who had stayed quiet until now and chosen this moment, with Graves in town and the legal situation accelerating, to speak. A friend. She did not know who it was. But the fact of it, the existence of someone who had watched and waited and chosen to help her, settled something in her chest that had been wound tight for weeks. She was not as alone in this as it had felt. She was still thinking about it when Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway at nearly 10 o'clock, which was unusual for him. He was a man who kept early hours in both directions. "Couldn't sleep," he said, by way of explanation. "Coffee's still warm," she said. He poured himself a cup and sat across the table from her. He looked at the ledgers, then at her face, then at the ledgers again. "I've been thinking about the letter," he said. "So have I. If they planned this, if Graves and Holloway had some arrangement before you arrived, that means the forged entries in the receiving ledger weren't just Wade protecting himself after you started asking questions. That was always going to happen. One way or another, your name was always going to end up on something wrong." She had reached the same conclusion 20 minutes ago. Hearing it aloud made it more concrete and less comfortable. "Yes," she said, "which means they needed you here specifically, not just any cook." He was working through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, piece by piece, no shortcuts. "You had the documentation on Graves from the estate. If you arrived here and found Holloway's scheme, you'd bring it to me. And then when Graves needed to move against you, he'd have a ready-made picture. A woman who comes to a ranch, insinuates herself into the finances, creates evidence against the foreman, all to cover her own fraudulent activity. My credibility destroys itself," Eleanor said. "The harder I fight, the more it looks like I'm covering something." "It's a trap," Cole said. "And you walked into it on your own." "With my own luggage," she said. It was a dark thing to say, and she said it dryly, and Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who has recognized the specific grimness of a situation and found, unexpectedly, that someone else has named it precisely. "What do we do?" he said. She appreciated that we. She filed it away alongside everything else she was collecting about this man. "We tell Tuttle in the morning. The letter changes the shape of things. If Graves can be shown to have had a prior arrangement with Holloway, if those two meetings can be documented, it undermines everything Graves has filed and establishes intent." "Can we document the meetings?" "The letter writer can, if they're willing to come forward. And if they're not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we work with what we have, and we hope the forgery case is strong enough to carry it." Cole turned his coffee mug in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking. She'd noticed it weeks ago and never mentioned it. "I had a letter from my attorney in Wichita today," he said. "Not Tuttle. The one who handles the ranch's property matters. He says there's a claim being prepared, against the ranch." She looked up sharply. "What kind of claim?" "Ownership dispute. Someone is going to argue that there's a prior lien against a section of the Blackthorn land that was never properly resolved." He said it flatly, but she could hear what was underneath it. "My attorney says it's likely frivolous, but it'll require a court hearing to dismiss." "When was the lien filed?" "That's the thing." He set the mug down. "He can't find it. There's a reference to it in a county document, but the original instrument isn't where it should be." Eleanor felt something cold move through her thinking. "It's a paper that doesn't exist." "Or one that's going to appear," Cole said, "right before the hearing." She thought about forged signatures. She thought about supply records altered in careful handwriting. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years constructing the infrastructure of a legal attack before a single shot was fired. "He's not just going after me," she said. "He's going after you." "I know that." "Cole." She leaned forward slightly. "If he creates a lien that threatens the ranch's land title, that's a different magnitude of fight. That's not just my history with his family. That's your property, your life's work." "I know that too," he said. His voice was very level. "And I'll tell you what I told Tuttle this morning. I'm in this. All of it." He met her eyes directly. "You didn't bring this to my door. They brought it here. And I've been on this land for 22 years, and nobody with a forged piece of paper is taking any part of it." The lamp between them was burning low. The kitchen was warm, and the rest of the house was dark and quiet. "You're angry," she said. Not accusingly, just observing it. "I'm very angry," he said. "I'm just not loud about it." She understood that. She understood it particularly well. "All right," she said. "Then tomorrow morning we go to Tuttle together and we tell him all of it. The letter, the lien reference, the meeting between Graves and Holloway. And we let him tell us what order to hit it in." Cole nodded. He finished his coffee and stood up. He stood there for a moment, just a beat longer than he needed to before going back to bed. And she looked up at him from the table, and the lamp threw warm light on both of them, and the moment sat between them like something that hadn't been named yet. Eleanor, he said. Yes. A pause. I want you to know that whatever happens with the legal case, whatever the outcome, your place here isn't conditional on it. He said it carefully, like a man who has rehearsed the sentence and still isn't sure he's saying it right. You came here, you did the work, you earned what you've been given. That doesn't go away based on what Graves manages to file. She looked at him for a long moment. You can't promise that, she said. Not if there's a land claim against the ranch. If your property is compromised, I can promise it, he said. I'm promising it. She didn't have a ready answer for that, which was unusual for her. Get some sleep, she said finally. We have a long day tomorrow. He nodded and went. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, steady and unhurried, and then the house was quiet again. She sat at the table for another 10 minutes, the ledgers open in front of her without seeing them. Then she blew out the lamp and went to her room. Elda Croft arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days later. She was smaller than Eleanor remembered, though memory often makes people larger than they are. And she had aged in the way that hard winters age people, her face deeper lined and her hair fully white now. But her eyes were the same, sharp, clear, and direct in the way of someone who had made her peace with saying uncomfortable things because life was too short for anything else. She came in on the afternoon stage, and Eleanor was at the station to meet her, which meant standing on the Harlow Creek platform where people could see her greeting this elderly woman from out of county, which was entirely intentional. Let people see. Let them wonder. Let the wondering be part of the picture. Elda took Eleanor's hands when she stepped off and held them for a moment, looking at her the way a person looks at someone they've been worried about. You look better than I feared, she said. You came all this way, Eleanor said. I told you I would. Elda released her hands and looked around the platform with the alert curiosity of a woman arriving somewhere new and already assessing it. This where the trouble is? Most of it. Good. She picked up her own bag before Eleanor could reach for it. Take me somewhere warm and tell me everything from the beginning. I need to understand the whole shape of it before I talk to your lawyer. Eleanor took her to the ranch. Marta made tea without being asked, set it on the kitchen table, and went about her business nearby in a way that was entirely tactful and entirely present. Eleanor told Elda everything. She told it in the order it had happened, and she told it plainly, without softening the parts that reflected badly on her own judgment or her own moments of doubt. Elda listened with her teacup in both hands and her eyes steady on Eleanor's face, and she asked questions that were precise and sometimes uncomfortable, the kind of questions that a good witness asks to make sure she understands what she actually saw versus what she's been told. The lien on the estate property, Elda said. I know about that. I saw Daniel Graves bring a man to the house 3 months after your husband died, before you left. The man had papers. Eleanor set her cup down. You saw it. Saw Graves bring him, saw them go inside, saw your face the day you found out what those papers said. Elda met her eyes. I didn't understand the full legal weight of it at the time, but I understood enough to know it wasn't right, and I said nothing, and I have thought about that every week since. You're here now, Eleanor said. I'm here now, Elda agreed. And I'll tell that lawyer everything I just told you, and I'll tell it in court if it comes to that. I'm 71 years old, I have nothing to protect and no reason to lie. She said it with such simple, settled certainty that Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. The particular relief of having someone in your corner who is beyond intimidation, not because they're powerful, but because they genuinely don't care about the things that can be used against them. Cole shook Elda's hand that evening and said very little, which Elda seemed to respect. She assessed him in the frank way she assessed everything, and apparently reached a conclusion she found acceptable, because she said to Eleanor later, in the kitchen, while Marta was out of earshot, He's a good man. He is, Eleanor said. He's also not as opaque as he thinks he is. Eleanor looked at her. Elda, I'm old, Elda said. Not blind. She picked up her teacup. Now, when do I meet this lawyer? Tuttle met with Elda the next morning and came away from the meeting with an expression Eleanor hadn't seen on him before, something close to satisfaction, which on Tuttle's careful face was roughly equivalent to another man's broad smile. She's an excellent witness, he said. Clear, specific, unshakable. She understands the difference between what she observed and what she's inferring, and she makes that distinction herself without being prompted. He looked at Eleanor. Where did you find her? She was my neighbor for 12 years, Eleanor said. She's been waiting 12 years to say this in a room where someone was required to listen. He gathered his papers. We're in good shape. The forgery examination is scheduled for next week in Caldwell. Mrs. Croft will need to travel there for her deposition. I'll go with her, Eleanor said. You should. He paused. Graves has retained a local attorney, a man named Sutter. He's competent but not exceptional. He's going to try to argue that Mrs. Croft's age and her relationship with you compromise her reliability. Let him try, Elda said from the chair in the corner where she had been sitting quietly. I've been called unreliable by men who couldn't balance a household account. It hasn't stopped me yet. Tuttle looked at her over his glasses. No, he said. I don't imagine it has. It was the day before they were to leave for Caldwell that the worst thing happened. Eleanor found it in the morning supply delivery. Not in the goods themselves, but in the paperwork attached to them. A letter, tucked into the invoice from Calloway's store, addressed to Cole Mercer in an official-looking envelope with the county recorder's seal. She brought it to Cole unopened. She always brought his correspondence to him unopened. She had been careful about that, scrupulously careful, precisely because she understood how easily the opposite could be used against her. He read it at the kitchen table. His face went through several things in the space of a minute. Attention, then frown, then the particular stillness of controlled anger. He handed it to her. It was a formal notice from the county recorder's office. It notified Cole Mercer that a complaint had been filed with the county commissioners regarding the conduct of Eleanor Voss in her management of ranch accounts. The complaint alleged financial irregularities, specifically a pattern of supply orders that could not be fully reconciled against delivery records. The complaint was signed by Daniel Graves. Attached to it was a copy of the altered receiving ledger entry, the forged one. Doyle's work, which they had documented and preserved and which they could absolutely prove was added after the fact, but which, presented alone, without that context, looked exactly like what Graves needed it to look like. He went to the county recorder, Eleanor said. Webb, Cole said. Aldous Webb. The man Graves had breakfast with his first morning here. His jaw was tight. This isn't a court filing. It's an administrative complaint. It doesn't go to a judge. It goes to the commissioners. Who are? 3 men elected to manage county affairs. 2 of them I know well. The third, he stopped. The third is Harlan Dodd. He and Wade Holloway have been drinking together since before I came to this county. Eleanor looked at the letter, then at the forged entry attached to it. Then she looked up. They timed it, she said. We leave for Caldwell tomorrow. Graves filed this today, knowing we're about to go give evidence that will hurt him. If this complaint gets any traction before we come back, it creates a cloud over everything we present in Caldwell. It muddies the water, Cole said. Even if it goes nowhere, the existence of a formal complaint against you changes how our evidence looks. She was quiet for a moment. She was doing the thing she always did, thinking through it clearly, refusing to let the emotional weight of it push her into reacting before she'd thought. She had worked too hard and come too far to let one piece of paper knock her sideways. We need Tuttle today, she said. Before we leave. We show him this. We show him our documented version of that entry, the signed and dated copy from before the forgery. And we make sure he can present both in Caldwell if the commissioners attempt to slow walk our return. And the commissioners? Cole said. If Dodd tries to accelerate the hearing before we're back? Eleanor thought about it. Who's the most respected man in this county? She asked. Cole blinked. What? Not the most powerful, the most respected. The person whose word settles an argument because people trust it instinctively. Cole thought about it for a moment. Judge Ira Calloway. He's retired. Has been for 6 years. He doesn't involve himself in county politics. Could you ask him to? A long silence. Cole looked at her. You want me to ask a retired judge to vouch for your character to the county commissioners before we leave for Caldwell tomorrow morning. I want you to ask a retired judge if he's willing to take a look at what's been filed and give his personal opinion to the commissioners about whether it warrants immediate action. She met his eyes. If he says no, we lose nothing. If he says yes, it buys us time, Cole said. It buys us time, she agreed. He stood up. He picked his hat off the chair and put it on. "I'll go now," he said. "He lives 2 miles east." He was gone before she'd finished her coffee. She sat at the table with the county recorder's letter in front of her and the forged entry beside it, and she thought about how much had been stacked against her before she'd arrived here, and how much more had been stacked since. And she thought about the fact that despite all of it, she was still at this table, with evidence she could trust and people she could trust, and a case that was still standing. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. She folded the county letter carefully, tucked it with her other documents, and went to the stove to start the noon meal. Because whatever happened with judges and commissioners and county politics, 14 men still needed to eat. That was the work. And the work was still hers. Cole came back from Judge Calloway's house 2 hours later, and Eleanor knew from the way he walked across the yard that it had gone well. Not triumphantly well. Cole Mercer was not a man who carried triumph in his stride, but with the settled quality of someone who had gone looking for a specific thing and found it. He came into the kitchen, hung his hat on the peg by the door, and said, "He'll speak to the commissioners this afternoon." Eleanor set down the pot she was holding. He agreed. He read the forged entry. He read our documented version. He read Graves's complaint. Cole pulled out the chair and sat down. He said, and these are his words, that he spent 30 years watching men use official paperwork to do unofficial damage, and he's retired, not dead. A pause. He also said the forgery is obvious to anyone who knows what to look for. He's seen enough documents in his life to recognize one that doesn't belong where it's been put. Will the commissioners listen to him? 2 of them will. Dodd is the problem, but Dodd on his own can't force a hearing. Cole looked at her steadily. Calloway thinks he can get them to table the complaint until after the Caldwell proceedings. That's all we need. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Not a dramatic exhale, just the quiet release of someone who has been holding a breath they weren't fully aware of. "That's enough," she said. "It's enough," he agreed. They left for Caldwell the next morning before sunrise. Eleanor, Eldecroft, and Cole, in the ranch wagon with extra blankets against the February cold. Tuttle had gone ahead the previous day. The road to Caldwell was 4 hours on a good day, and this was not a particularly good day. The sky low and gray and the wind coming in sideways off the flat land with nothing kind in it. Elda sat in the wagon bed wrapped in 2 blankets and said almost nothing for the first hour, which Eleanor had come to understand was not discomfort, but concentration. The old woman was preparing herself, organizing what she knew into the order she was going to say it. Cole drove. Eleanor sat on the bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched when the wagon shifted, and neither of them mentioned it. Somewhere around the second hour, Elda said from the back, "Eleanor." "Yes." "I want you to know something. Before we get there and it all becomes official, and I'm a witness, and you're a complainant, and everything is formal." A pause. "I should have spoken sooner, when you were still in the county. I watched what Daniel did, and I told myself it wasn't my place, that families handle their own matters, that you were a grown woman who could manage her own affairs." Another pause. "I was wrong about all of that. Staying quiet wasn't staying neutral. It was choosing his side without admitting I was doing it." Eleanor turned to look at her. Elda was watching the road over Eleanor's shoulder, her expression clear and without self-pity. "You're here now," Eleanor said, which was what she had said before, and which she meant both times with the same weight. "I'm here now," Elda said. "I just needed you to know I understand the difference." Cole said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road, but his hands on the reins shifted slightly, and Eleanor thought he was the kind of man who heard everything and stored it carefully and said almost none of it, and that was all right. Some people carried the world loudly, some people carried it quietly. Both were carrying it. The courthouse in Caldwell was a solid brick building on the main street, newer than most of the town around it, with the particular solemnity of a building that understands its own purpose. Tuttle was waiting on the steps when they arrived, his rumpled brown coat insufficient for the cold, and his expression suggesting he had been there for some time and had used the waiting to think. He shook their hands and got immediately to business, which Eleanor had come to expect from him and appreciate. He led them inside to a small room off the main corridor, a waiting room, functionally, with wooden chairs and a table and a window that looked out on the side alley. And he laid out what was going to happen. The forgery examination had been completed. The court-appointed document examiner had compared the signature on the forged lien instrument to Eleanor's actual signature on 3 verified documents, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The signatures were not made by the same hand. He would testify to that. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 o'clock. It was not a full trial. It was a judicial review of the evidence to determine whether the estate fraud case had sufficient grounds to proceed to formal proceedings. But the forgery finding changed its weight considerably. If the lien instrument was forged, the entire financial structure Graves had constructed on top of Eleanor's late husband's estate was potentially fraudulent, not just the original transfer. "Sutter has filed 2 procedural objections this morning," Tuttle said. "Both routine, both denied. He's trying to delay, which tells me he understands how the morning went and doesn't like it." He looked at Eleanor. "You'll be asked to speak, not testimony. This isn't a trial. But the judge will want to hear from you directly about the timeline of events. Be precise. Be brief. Don't explain things he hasn't asked about." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you do." Elda gave her deposition in a separate room with Tuttle's Caldwell colleague, a careful man named Forsyth, who asked his questions in a flat, methodical way that Elda answered with the same precision she'd shown in Eleanor's kitchen. Eleanor was not present for it, but Forsyth came out afterward with a look that suggested Elda had given him exactly what he needed and possibly more. "She's remarkable," he said to Tuttle. "She knows what she saw," Tuttle said simply. The hearing began at 2 o'clock in a courtroom that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. The judge was a heavy-set man named Aldrich with a gray beard and reading glasses, and the unhurried manner of someone who has seen a great deal and stopped being impressed by most of it. Graves sat at the table across the aisle, with his attorney Sutter, who was younger than Eleanor had imagined and who spent a great deal of energy looking composed. Graves himself did not look at her when she came in. He looked at the judge, at his attorney, at the ceiling at one point, anywhere but at her. Eleanor found that more interesting than if he'd stared her down. A man who won't look at you in a room where the rules prevent him from threatening you is a man who has decided his best strategy is to pretend you don't quite exist. She had encountered that strategy before. She understood it for what it was. Cole sat in the gallery behind her. She could feel him there the way you feel a solid thing at your back. Not because it's pressing against you, but because you know it's there if you need it. The document examiner testified first. He was a small, dry man named Vage, who had spent 30 years examining legal instruments and who presented his findings with the unapologetic certainty of a man reporting observable facts. The signature on the lien document was not Eleanor's. The ink composition was consistent with forgery. A different pen, applied at a different pressure and angle than the genuine signatures. The document had been altered after its original creation, and not skillfully. Sutter cross-examined him for 20 minutes and accomplished nothing, which Eleanor could tell Sutter understood because he sat down with the controlled expression of a man absorbing a loss and moving on. Elda's deposition was read into the record by Forsyth. The room was quiet during it. Eleanor listened to Elda's words in someone else's voice, the precise, unadorned account of what she had witnessed, the dates she had noted because she was a woman who kept a diary and had done so for 40 years, the specific details that made the abstract feel real and the real feel undeniable. Then Judge Aldrich looked at Eleanor and said, "Mrs. Voss, I'd like to hear from you about the sequence of events as you experienced them. Start with when you first understood that something had been taken from the estate." She stood. She thought of Tuttle's instruction, precise, brief, don't explain what hasn't been asked. She spoke for 11 minutes. She was aware of the time because she'd been aware of time in that particular way since she was a girl, and had learned that the length of time you spoke was often used against you. Too short meant you were hiding something. Too long meant you were manufacturing it. 11 minutes was what the facts required, and she gave the facts the space they needed and nothing more. When she sat down, the courtroom was quiet in the way that means people are processing rather than waiting. Sutter made his argument for Graves. He was competent, as Tuttle had said. He acknowledged the forgery finding rather than contesting it, which was the right move, and tried instead to argue that it was impossible to establish that Graves himself had ordered or executed the forgery, that the document may have been produced by a third party without Graves's knowledge, and that the overall estate transfer had been conducted through proper legal channels with Eleanor's informed consent. It was a reasonable argument in the way that a building with no foundation is a reasonable building. The structure is there, but stand on it too hard, and it goes through. Tuttle's rebuttal took 8 minutes. He connected the forged lien to the original transfer. He connected Graves's prior relationship with Wade Holloway to the supply fraud at Blackthorn Ranch. He presented the letter, the anonymous letter, about the 2 meetings, not as testimony, which it wasn't, but as context for a pattern of behavior that spanned 2 counties and 3 years. He was precise and methodical and entirely without drama, which was, Eleanor had come to understand, his particular gift. Drama-invited contest. Facts, laid carefully in sequence, built something that was harder to knock over. Judge Aldrich did not rule immediately. He said he would have his written findings within 2 days and that the parties would be notified by post. He looked at both tables with the same level expression, which told Eleanor nothing about his conclusions, which she suspected was intentional. They filed out of the courtroom into the cold afternoon air. Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the outside air and felt the particular hollow quality of having done everything you can do and now having to wait for someone else to decide if it was enough. Cole came to stand beside her. Elda was behind them, talking to Forsyth about something practical. "You did well," Cole said. "I told the truth in the right order," she said. "That's all I did." "That's harder than it sounds." She looked at him. He was watching the street below them, the ordinary afternoon movement of a town that had no idea what had just happened in the building behind them. And his profile was serious and familiar in the way things become familiar when you've spent enough days watching them. "Are you all right?" he asked, still watching the street. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me when the ruling comes." He nodded. "Fair enough." They drove back to Blackthorn that evening, arriving after dark, the ranch lights warm in the distance as they came across the flat land. Eleanor had not realized, until she saw those lights, how much she had come to think of this place as something she was coming back to rather than simply arriving at. That was a quiet thing, that shift, and she sat with it for the last mile without examining it too closely. Marta had kept supper warm. The men had eaten already, but Hector was still at the table when they came in, ostensibly finishing his coffee and not at all waiting to hear how it had gone. He looked at Eleanor's face and then at Cole's and said, "Well?" "We wait," Eleanor said. 2 days. Hector turned his coffee mug in his hands. "But it went all right." Eleanor considered the question honestly. "As well as it could," she said. Hector nodded slowly, the way old men nod when they've decided something confirms what they already believed. "Good," he said, and finished his coffee and went to the bunkhouse. The 2 days were long. Eleanor worked. That was what she did with time that couldn't be controlled. She filled it with work that could. She finished the March supply reconciliation. She started the April ordering. She walked the barn inventory again and found no new discrepancies, which was itself a kind of progress. She taught Agnes a better system for tracking kitchen stores that Agnes would be able to maintain independently, which was something Eleanor had been meaning to do for a while. Because you didn't build a system and then make yourself indispensable to it. That was how Holloway had operated, and she had no interest in any version of that. Cole did not pace or perform anxiety, which she would have found exhausting in another person and found reassuring in him. He ran the ranch. He reviewed the accounts. He came by the kitchen in the mornings for his coffee and stayed a little longer than usual in the way of someone who values the particular steadiness of a specific place at a specific time. And Eleanor understood that because she felt the same way about those mornings, and she was not going to think too hard about what that meant until the more pressing things were resolved. The ruling arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, which was 1 day later than promised, which had done nothing good for anyone's nerves. Tuttle's letter came with it. He had received his copy first and written immediately. Eleanor read Tuttle's letter, standing at the kitchen table with Cole across from her and Marta at the stove performing the most obvious possible pretense of not listening. Tuttle wrote with his characteristic absence of embellishment. "The findings are in our favor on all primary counts. The Lion instrument has been ruled fraudulent and is vacated. The original estate transfer has been referred for full review on grounds of potential coercion and forgery, which is the strongest possible outcome at this stage. The court has issued a summons for Graves to appear before the review panel within 30 days. Sutter will certainly file for extension, which is his right, but the instrument is vacated and cannot be reinstated pending review. Your husband's estate, Mrs. Voss, is not yet restored. That is the work of the full proceedings. But the fraudulent claim against it no longer has legal standing. You have, at minimum, removed the weapon he was using. The rest is a longer road. I will be in touch. H. Tuttle. Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it down on the table. Cole was watching her. Marta had given up the pretense and was watching her too. She said, "The lien is vacated." Neither of them said anything immediately, which was the right response, because the moment was not a simple one. It was not a victory in the way that victories are sometimes imagined, clean, total, final. It was the removal of one weapon in a fight that still had road ahead of it. But it was real, and it was documented, and it belonged to her, Cole said quietly. Good. Marta said nothing. She turned back to the stove, and Eleanor heard her exhale once, long and slow, which from Marta was equivalent to a standing ovation. Eleanor sat down. She put her hands flat on the table the way she did when she needed to feel something solid. She thought about her husband's estate, the house, the small hardware business, the accounts that should have come to her and instead went into Daniel Graves's pocket while she was still sitting with her grief. She thought about 12 years of managing a sick man's life with patience and competence and without complaint, and the way all of that had been dismissed and ignored and ultimately stolen from her by a man who had simply assumed she wouldn't know how to fight back. She had known how. She had just needed somewhere safe enough to do it from. She looked around the kitchen, at the organized shelves, the hanging pots, the small desk in the corner where she kept the ranch accounts, the fire that she started every morning before anyone else was awake. She thought about the men who ate at this table and the work that had been done here, and the systems she'd built that would keep running because they were built on logic rather than personality. She had made something here, and she had protected it, and that was not nothing. That was in fact the whole of what she'd been trying to do since the day she stepped off the train at Harlow Creek with one suitcase and the particular determined stillness of someone who has decided the worst is behind them and means to make that true. The county commissioner's complaint was formally dismissed 2 weeks later, after Judge Calloway's intervention, and the news from Caldwell rendered it moot. Aldous Webb, the county recorder, sent a formal letter to Blackthorn Ranch acknowledging that the complaint had been withdrawn. Eleanor suspected that Webb had also had a private conversation with Cole that she was not privy to and that Cole would not fully describe, but she knew what the outcome of those conversations looked like when they were finished, and this one looked finished. Daniel Graves left Harlow Creek the same week. He did not announce his departure. He simply was gone one morning, the hotel room empty. His rental horse returned and the town left to piece together the shape of what had happened from the absence where he'd been. Wade Holloway was less quiet about it. He attempted, through Sutter's office, to file a counterclaim against Blackthorn Ranch alleging wrongful dismissal and defamation. Tuttle dealt with it in 2 letters and a brief appearance before a county magistrate that lasted less than an hour. The claim was dismissed. The documented evidence of Holloway's supply fraud was attached to the dismissal record, which meant it now existed in the official county file under his name. That was the last legal move. Not a dramatic conclusion, no final confrontation, no speech in a packed courtroom where everyone learned the truth at once. Just paper, filed correctly, in the right order, with the right signatures, building a record that would outlast everyone involved in it. Eleanor had expected to feel more when it was over. She had spent so many months in the forward-leaning posture of someone fighting, constantly calculating the next move, that when the immediate threat finally subsided, she found herself standing in a kitchen she'd spent 6 months making right, with nothing urgent pressing against her from any direction, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. She made bread. It was a Thursday. The dough needed 30 minutes, and she gave it 40 because she wasn't in a hurry, and she stood at the table and worked it with her hands and thought about Elda Croft, who had gone back to her own county the week before with Eleanor's genuine gratitude and a jar of preserved pears from Marta that Elda had claimed were unnecessary and then packed very carefully into her bag. She thought about the anonymous letter writer, the person who had told her about Graves and Holloway's meetings, who had never come forward and whose identity she had never confirmed. She thought she knew, or thought she almost knew, and she had decided it didn't matter. Whoever they were, they had watched something happen that was wrong, and they had chosen, at some risk to themselves, to say something. That deserved quiet recognition rather than exposure. There were people like that in every community, she had come to believe. People who watched carefully and said nothing publicly and occasionally, at the right moment, said the one thing that mattered. They were not heroes in the story they told about themselves. They were just people who had decided that staying silent wasn't the same as staying clean. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise. Cole found her there an hour later, which had become the kind of thing that happened naturally now. Him finding her in the kitchen, or her finding him in the office. The movement between their separate spaces grown easy with repetition. He sat at the table. She poured him coffee without being asked, which had also become natural, in the way of two people who have spent enough time together that small courtesies stop requiring conscious thought. He looked at his coffee. Tuttle sent a note. The Caldwell proceedings are scheduled for May. The full review of the estate. I know, she said. I got the same note. You'll need to go back. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The bread was rising on the counter. The fire was steady. Outside, she could hear Pete talking to one of the horses in the yard, that low, patient voice he used with animals that was the best version of him. Eleanor, Cole said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee mug, turning it in his hands in that way he had. He was not, she had come to understand, an uncertain man. He was a careful one. There was a difference. Uncertainty comes from not knowing your own mind. Carefulness comes from knowing it and wanting to get the words right. I asked you here as a cook, he said. I know that. I kept you on because you were good at it, and then because you were good at everything else you turned your hand to. He paused. I want you to know that I know the difference between keeping someone because they're useful and wanting them to stay because... He stopped, looked up from the mug. Because the place would be wrong without them. She held his gaze. The kitchen will be fine, she said carefully. Agnes has learned the system. The accounts are documented. Any competent person could... That's not what I mean, he said. She knew it wasn't. She had known it wasn't for a while. She had been choosing not to address it directly because she was, in this one specific area, less brave than she was in every other, and she understood that about herself without particular pride. Cole, she said, I came here with nothing, less than nothing. I came here with debt and a legal problem and a past that someone was actively using against me. I have nothing to offer you that isn't complicated. I run a ranch in Kansas, he said. Everything here is complicated. I'm not asking you for anything right now, he said. It was not impatient. It was gentle, in the understated way that was his version of gentleness. I'm telling you something. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. The bread was rising. The fire was steady. The morning was going on around them in all its ordinary, continued ways. All right, she said. I heard you. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood up, and at the door he stopped and said, without turning around, The men are asking if you'd come out to the south pasture this afternoon. Hector wants to show you something about the cattle count. He says he needs a second opinion on the records, and he doesn't trust his own eyes anymore. She looked at the bread. He needs my opinion on the cattle count. He's very specific that it has to be you. She understood perfectly well that Hector did not need her opinion on the cattle count. She also understood that this was Hector's particular way of telling her that she belonged on the whole ranch, and not just in the kitchen of it, and that the men had decided this on their own, without being asked, and this was how they were saying it. Tell him I'll be out at 2, she said. Cole's voice carried something in it that was close to warmth. I'll tell him. He left. She turned back to the bread. She thought about what it meant to earn a place. Not to be given one. Given places came with conditions, and could be revoked by whoever's hand had given them. She thought about what it meant to build something through the accumulation of daily, unspectacular choices, to show up, to work, to notice what needed noticing, to say the difficult thing. When the difficult thing was what was needed, and to stay standing when the people who underestimated you decided to push. She thought about her husband, who had been a decent man compromised by illness, and by a brother who understood how to use a grieving person's confusion. She did not grieve him with anger, which she had once and which had exhausted her. She grieved him now with something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that love and disappointment can occupy the same space, that a life spent with someone who was not all you hoped doesn't mean the life was wasted, and that what you learn in a difficult marriage is not nothing. She had learned to keep accounts. She had learned to read a supply ledger and a person's face with the same patient attention. She had learned that the world consistently underestimates women who don't fit its preferred image, and she had learned to use that underestimation as a tool, the same way you use the weight of something heavy by letting it move where it wants and stepping aside to redirect it. None of that was painless to learn, but it had brought her here, to this kitchen, this ranch, this particular complicated morning with bread rising on the counter and a man who had just told her, in his careful, understated way, that she mattered to him. She was 43 years old. She had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch in February with one suitcase and the private, stubborn conviction that she was not finished yet. She had not been finished. In May, she went to Caldwell for the full estate proceedings. Tuttle was there. Forsyth was there. Eldecroft came back because Eldecroft was, as she had said herself, not a tired woman. The proceedings took 3 days. They were not dramatic because legal proceedings of substance rarely are. They are tedious and precise and full of documents and procedural arguments and long pauses while things are examined. At the end of the third day, the review panel issued its findings. The original estate transfer was ruled invalid on the grounds of undue influence and fraudulent documentation. The lion was confirmed vacated. The estate, what remained of it after 3 years of Daniel Graves's management, which was considerably less than it had been, was ordered returned to Eleanor's control. She stood outside this courthouse afterward with Tuttle, who accepted her thanks with the brief nod of a man who found excessive gratitude embarrassing, and with Elda, who pressed her hands again the way she had on the Harlow Creek platform and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Cole was waiting with the wagon. She climbed up onto the bench seat beside him, and he turned the horses toward home, and the Caldwell streets gave way to open land, and the land stretched out flat and wide in every direction under a May sky that was finally genuinely warm. They did not speak much on the way back. They had become, over the course of the months since February, people who were comfortable with each other's quiet. That was not a small thing. It was, in Eleanor's experience, rarer than most people admitted. The ability to be in the same space as another person without filling it, without performance, without the noise that people make to cover the fact that they're not sure they belong. She belonged here. She had made sure of that. An hour from the ranch, Cole said, "What will you do with the estate? What's left of it?" She had been thinking about it. "Whatever it is, it's mine. I'll decide once I know what I actually have." She watched the land. "I'm not leaving, if that's what you're asking." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't asking that directly." "I know you weren't." She looked at him. "I'm telling you anyway." He looked back at her for just a moment before returning his eyes to the road. And what was on his face in that moment was not complicated. It was simply the face of a man who has received news he was hoping for and is trying not to show how much he was hoping for it. She looked back at the road too. "The South Pasture cattle count," she said. "Hector's records were 2 head off last week. I've been meaning to look into that." "He'll be glad to hear it," Cole said. "I imagine he will," she said. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light. The roof lines, the barn, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the small figures of men moving in the yard. Pete was at the gate. Hector was near the barn. Marta was, Eleanor knew without seeing her, in the kitchen where the fire was already built and something was already on. It was not a perfect place. The work was hard and the winters were brutal, and the prairie had no interest in human comfort. The men were imperfect, generous in some ways, and frustrating in others, as men always are. The legal road still had some distance to run, and there would be months of correspondence with Tuttle and documentation to organize before the estate was fully resolved. And Eleanor Voss was not a perfect person. She knew that with the clarity of someone who has made enough mistakes to stop pretending otherwise. She was impatient sometimes. She held things close when she should have said them out loud. She trusted systems more than she trusted feelings, which had protected her many times and cost her in others. She was, at 43, still learning which moments called for which approach. But she was here. The wagon rolled through the gate, and Pete took the horses, and Hector raised a hand from across the yard. And Cole helped her down from the bench without making a ceremony of it. Just a hand extended and taken, the ordinary gesture of two people who have decided to make their lives adjacent to each other and are figuring out, one day at a time, what that means. She walked toward the kitchen door. The thing she had come to understand, in the months since February and the hard miles since the death of her husband and the harder miles before that, The thing that the legal victories hadn't taught her, but that the daily work had, was that the world did not reward you for being overlooked. It did not eventually look up and notice and apologize. It simply continued, indifferent, doing what it had always done. The reward, if there was one, came from the decision you made inside the being overlooked. Whether you stayed quiet and let it define you, or whether you kept your own counsel about what you were worth, kept your eyes open and your record straight and your hands steady, and waited for the moment when all of that careful, unacknowledged work became the thing that nobody could take from you. Nobody could take this from her now. She pushed open the kitchen door. The warmth came out to meet her. She could smell the bread that Marta had started, and the coffee, and the particular smell of an evening meal in progress that she associated, now and probably permanently, with the word home. She hung up her coat. She tied on her apron. She went to work.